Let's take a look at the different types of invoices K9 offers. I'm sure by now if you've gone to financial and accounts receivable, you'll see there are 4 types of invoices here. On accounts payable, we have also 3 over there: purchase invoice, vendor invoice, and COD invoice. Let's take a look at the differences between them and when you should use what type of invoice. So you'll see over here we have a customer shipment invoice, a sales invoice, an over-the-counter invoice, and a pro forma invoice. Each one of these performs different tasks or parts of a task, and knowing how you're going to work with the system will define what type of invoicing you're going to use. You can use a combination of different types of invoices, or for simplicity's sake, you can set up a procedure and use the same invoice type each time. So I've created this chart over here in Excel, very simple, just to show you the differences on what happens. And let's take a look first at the sales side and the 4 types of invoices that we have. So there are 3 basic processes for getting inventory out of your system and invoicing your customer, and of course getting the money. You have the inventory movement. This relieves the inventory burden from you and pass on to the customer. And depending on the type of transaction you do, you may have an unbilled shipment journal entry to record that money until you invoice the customer. You have the financial obligation, which of course is the invoice, which defines what the customer owes you. And then you have the payment settled, which is the receipt, getting the money from the customer. So the 4 different invoices we have each perform a different set of these processes. So let's review what we have. You have the shipment invoice. The only thing the shipment invoice does is create the financial obligation. It does not move inventory. So if you sell 1,000,000 units in the shipment invoice without creating a shipping document first, you will not have reduced any of your inventory. So this is handy for things like non-physical goods, things like that, maybe replacement items. You may want to think about this invoice. That's its primary role. Again, you typically don't use this as a standalone invoice if you have any kind of inventory, because it won't keep accurate numbers. You have the sales invoice. Now the sales invoice performs 2 steps: the inventory movement and the financial obligation. So let's say you're just going into warehouse, grabbing something for the customer and handing it to him, and he's going to put it on his account. You can use the sales invoice. You're going to reduce your inventory, you're going to create the financial obligation from the customer, and of course he's eventually going to pay it based on his account. And they have an OTC invoice, or over-the-counter invoice. Think of this like a simple point of sale. This one moves your inventory, it creates a financial obligation, and it settles the payment by means of a receipt within the form. Okay, so basically it's like a cash register. If you go to a supermarket and your bill is $20, you have to give them $20. You can't give them $15 and say put the rest on my account. So in this case, it's the over-the-counter invoice. It's a similar transaction. And finally, you have the pro forma invoice. The pro forma is really just a dummy invoice. It does not record anything. No inventory movement, no financials. It's typically also called an export invoice or commercial invoice. Okay, so let's take a look back in K9 and see where these are, okay, and how the process works for each of them. So again, once we said financial, accounts receivable, and you'll have the 4 receivable invoices here. Okay, now let's look at the simplest one, and that's the sales invoice. Okay, sales invoice, I'm going to go ahead and select my customer. Okay, we'll use our Carl admin as usual. You have all the parameters over here. Okay, remember that they are basing this on their account, so you do have the available payment terms and things like that available in here. Okay, and you're going to go ahead and itemize this. Now, I'm itemizing it in the sales invoice. Okay, there is another option to do it right from the sales order, which we're going to check out in a separate video. Okay, so I have my invoice itemized. I post this one. I'll get my notification that it posted successfully, and that's it. Now I relieve my inventory, I created the debt to the customer, and that's it. He's going to eventually mail me a check, so he has an open balance right now. That's the sales invoice as a standalone. Let's take a look at the sales invoice connected to a sales order, which is possible as well. So if I'm going to create a sales order over here, let's go ahead and create a new one for that same customer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and itemize this with an item. Go. I'm going to go ahead and change this invoice to one that allows invoice. Now here's the big difference on here. Okay, when you first set up K9, you'll notice in the workflow that there was 2 default statuses called allow shipment and allow invoice. Okay, if I create allow invoice over here, the system is going to assume that I'm skipping the normal shipping process, and if you look under the actions, I won't be able to ship it out. So I'm going to go ahead and allow invoice, and I'm going to go ahead and create an invoice from here. Okay. If you have your pop-up blocker enabled, make sure to allow K9 to go in there. Okay. So now, just like the sales order, it's got the same itemization, the same parameters, everything that I placed within the sales order. And I'm just going to go ahead and finalize this, or rather post it, just like I did the last invoice. So that's really the only difference. You can base it on a sales order or not. You'll have, of course, all the references that you expect over here, and you'll be able to base it on this sales order. So now let's take a look at the shipment invoice and how that's going to work. Okay, so the shipment invoice, again, it's based on the assumption that you have a normal logistics cycle and you're shipping products out. So I'm going to go ahead and create a sales order over here. Okay, same customer, we'll use him again. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and itemize this with just an item over here. Okay. Now, keep in mind that there are different ways to pick the products. Okay, if you recall going back over here, you do have to remove that inventory with the inventory movement to do, any of these invoices. So we want to go ahead and move the inventory through this form. So there's a separate video that we have called, different picking options within K9. For now, I'm going to go ahead and use the most common one, which is the picking work area. So I'm going to go ahead and select this Allow Shipment. And on my actions, I'm going to go ahead and create a picking work area. Okay. Now, I'm doing this all through actions. You can, of course, go in and manually select those items. So on outbound logistics, I have that picking work area, which would bring me to the same form as this, just not linked automatically. Okay. So now, there again, in another video, there's different picking options because there are many options for lots, serial numbers, multiple bin locations, split picking, things like that. But for now, I'm going to keep it simple and just hit my add pick and accept all the defaults. So now what this did is it went ahead and created a picking for that sales order. Okay. Again, if you go back in a sales order, you'll see all the trail for this. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and create a shipping document. Okay. Again, it opens a separate document. Now, we went through the full logistics cycle assuming a multi-personnel warehousing system. So somebody's picking the products, somebody over here is approving the counts, and go ahead and creating the shipment. So there's different ways you can do that. Once again, it's covered under the different ways to pick videos. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this one. I'm going to go ahead and allow invoice. Okay. Now, we didn't do any shipping integrations or anything like that. Those are, of course, all options that you have available as well. So now I created this shipping document. Now, at this point, if I look at the journal entry for this document, you're going to see that it creates an unbilled shipment transaction. Okay. So this is basically a suspense account until we create the invoice. The invoice will reverse this transaction. So I'm going to go ahead back in my shipping document. Once again, I can go ahead and just create a shipping invoice from there. It's going to create that invoice. Everything is going to be populated. Everything is fine. Now, really, this is very much an on and off switch. So there's nothing really you can or should do over here unless some grievous error was made. Okay, remember, you have 2 opportunities at least to verify counts, serial numbers, lot numbers. You can create all those rules within the workflow. So you want to get it to a point where once it's at the invoice stage, everything has already been checked and verified. And the only thing you should do is go ahead and change that to final. Okay, that's it. If we take a look at the journal entry, we're going to see that I went ahead and it reversed that unbilled purchase transaction and created the journal entry. Okay, now remember, you have the ability to modify these entries in the default journal entries if you need to make any changes to the way you work. Okay, so that's essentially creating the shipment invoice process. Okay, again, you can create the different ways to pick if you'd like. Now, one of the invoices that we saw was the over-the-counter invoice. Let's go ahead and create one of those. And just as a side note, if you're using K9's point of sale, the transaction that point of sale creates is right over here. So it's the same exact invoice used in the point of sale. You can create it over here. So that's a nice little place to be able to do a couple of different things. So the over-the-counter invoice, very simply, again, let's go ahead and itemize this invoice. Sell them a product over here. Okay. Now, a couple of things that are different over here. One, you'll notice, first of all, the bank and cashier. You don't see this on other invoices. And you see that it's defaulted to primary cashier and it's read-only. There's several ways you can create cashier accounts and different ways you can use them. I have this one, for instance, linked to my username, so it doesn't let me change it. This is good for, a light point of sale, think like a warehouse outlet kind of thing, okay? So once again, I have it itemized. Now, if I try to finalize this over here, okay, or rather click on post it, I'll get a notification over here that the amount of receipt is not equal to the final price. Okay, so basically, the whole idea is this. My final price is $8, and the balance due is $8 because nothing has been paid. So if I go to the Payments tab over here, and again, I have my different payment options, including the K9 credit card processor. Well, let's go ahead and take cash for now. So I'm going to take cash over here. I'm going to save the line, and now you'll see my amount paid is $8, my balance due at 0. You can accept as many different forms of payments as you want in any combination, as long as that balance due equals $0. So now I'm going to go ahead and post this invoice, and there we go. If I take a look at my journal entry, I'll see that it's a very simple journal entry. It doesn't involve unbilled shipments or anything like that. And once again, you have the ability to modify these entry patterns. Okay, so that's our over-the-counter invoice. Remember, now finally, we have our pro forma invoice. Now, again, the pro forma doesn't do anything, doesn't create any entries whatsoever. There's no journal entries, no inventory movement. You're free to do whatever you like over here, okay? So we'll go ahead and just itemize this. And that's it. I just finalize this by posting it, and that's all there is to it. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind with the invoices. I'm sure as you've noticed, the invoice numbers change once you finalize a document. For instance, if I go in here and I'll bring up an existing invoice that we have over here, it's in draft status, let's say. You see that this invoice number starts with a T dash, okay? And the status is draft. Once I finalize or post the invoices, it'll create a real invoice number. At this point, changes can no longer be made to the invoice. Prior to hitting posted, you can make whatever changes you require. Once it's posted, it is set in stone. The only things you can update is attachments and remarks. So that is something very important to keep in mind. It's a great security process because it prevents people from making changes to an invoice you already posted. So now those are our sales invoices. We're going to take a look at the purchase invoices next.